On December 25th, 2008, 38-year-old Margaret Sweet, also known by the online alias Shelby Jamison, was found dead on the front porch of her father's home in Colorado Springs. Her life ended violently, and nearly 2 decades later, the person responsible still walks free. Who was Margaret Sweet? Before we reconstruct the events of that tragic holiday, it's important to understand who Margaret was. Margaret Sweet, sometimes called May Sweet in official records, was a 38-year-old woman with a vibrant spirit and a love for life that extended beyond the headlines of her death. She was described by friends and community members as someone with an adventurous soul who enjoyed music and the outdoors, and who had a thoughtful, giving nature. She occasionally used the name Shelby Jamison as an online alias, an identity that would appear in social circles and digital spaces, but not necessarily in legal documentation. Margaret was also close to her family, especially her father, and it was in her father's presence that her life was ultimately taken. In the months leading up to her death, Margaret's personal life had grown complicated. Earlier in 2008, she had been living in Nashville, Tennessee, where she met a man named Jer Dale Batts. The relationship was described by sources as tumultuous. On May 13, 2008, Margaret took the serious step of filing an order of protection against Batts after he allegedly followed her across state lines from Nashville to Colorado Springs. According to accounts, Batts had tracked her movements, leaving gifts at her car that included a teddy bear, a dozen red roses, and an engagement ring. Margaret's father became aware of her concerns about Batts and at times helped her, trying to support her through the situation. However, and this is important, there is no official confirmation from law enforcement that Batts was ever arrested, charged, or formally considered a suspect in Margaret's murder. Despite speculation, authorities never publicly linked Batts to the shooting, and he maintained that he was not involved, saying at the time of the killing that he was on a date with another woman when Margaret was shot. On Wednesday, December 24, 2008, Margaret Sweet was spending time at her father's home in the 1300 block of Fosdick Circle in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Her stepmother, Peggy, was recovering from a recent surgical procedure at a local hospital, and Margaret and her father, James Egger, were taking turns visiting her there. That evening, neighbors later told investigators they overheard what sounded like a loud verbal argument coming from the direction of the home. The voices were between Margaret and an unidentified man, a man that no witness could name or positively identify. The argument was intense enough that neighbors remembered it, which, in a quiet suburban neighborhood late on Christmas Eve, was unusual. After the voices stopped, neighbors reported hearing a single gunshot. No one called 911. On the morning of Thursday, December 25, 2008, Margaret's father returned home from visiting his wife in the hospital. As he approached the house, he noticed something out of place on the white picket fence. Drawn closer, he made a terrible realization. The blood marked the presence of something far worse. There, on the porch, partially in the basement well, was Margaret's body, lifeless and covered in blood. She had been shot to death. Paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Margaret was pronounced dead. Even then, no one knew who had killed her or why. Law enforcement quickly treated the scene as a homicide investigation. Her body was discovered in a way that suggested she had not simply fallen or been shot randomly. The positioning of her body, the blood on the fence, and the proximity to the house all raised questions that would baffle investigators for years. Ballistics reports later showed that the same firearm used to kill Margaret had previously been used to injure a man in a 2007 drug deal, and while that other victim survived, no arrest had ever been made in that incident. This revelation that the weapon may have been connected to a previous shooting opened more questions than it answered. Did she know her killer? Was this a random act of violence, or was it a personal target?
Complicating matters, toxicology reports ultimately showed that Margaret was sober at the time of her death, which countered speculation that she had been drinking or impaired. There was no evidence that she was involved in the drug trade either, which meant the connection to the gun was mysterious. Despite the odd circumstances, a violent argument overheard by neighbors, a single gunshot, and a body discovered by her father, law enforcement never publicly named a suspect, and no arrests were ever announced. The Colorado Springs Police Department continued to list the case as an active homicide investigation and appealed to the public for any information that might lead to a suspect. A narrative like this naturally invites questions, especially around motive. Some accounts suggest possible involvement of her ex-boyfriend, given their documented tumultuous relationship before her death, though there is no official law enforcement statement publicly confirming that the ex-boyfriend was ever a suspect or charged. Other sources mention that the gun used was tied to an earlier shooting in 2007. However, no publicly available information ties that incident directly to the Margaret Sweet shooting beyond the firearms link, and that link has not led to a conviction or named suspect. Often in cases like this, speculation helps fill emotional gaps, but does not replace evidence. And as of the latest public records, no suspect has been publicly identified or arrested in this murder, which means the case remains legally open and unresolved. But two key factors keep interest alive: the brutality and suddenness of the act. A woman found shot to death on Christmas morning at her father's home is inherently shocking and unsettling. There has never been closure. Despite repeated calls for information, no suspect has been arrested, charged, or tried. Cold cases remain the most painful for families, not because of time, but because of what time does to unanswered questions. But for everyone who loved Margaret, justice delayed should not become justice denied.
Number 2. His name was Jack J. Krokacker, 23 years old. On the early morning of December 25, 1968, Jack was found shot on a Colorado Springs sidewalk and died shortly after. Despite investigations by local police and the FBI, no suspect was ever charged, and the case remains a cold homicide. Who was Jack Krokacker? Before the crime, Jack was a young man with a life that stretched beyond the headlines. He was born on May 1, 1945, in Ohio, and later lived in Parma, Ohio. Jack grew up in Ohio, where he graduated from Parma High School in 1963 and even became a district wrestling champion. He went on to complete 3 years as a mathematics major at the University of Dayton before his life was interrupted by military service, a common experience for many young American men during the 1960s. In May 1968, Jack was drafted into the United States Army. He trained hard and graduated first in his class from Army Finance School at Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana before being stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado. At Fort Carson, he served in the finance section, a non-combat role that put him in charge of financial matters rather than battle. For friends and neighbors in Colorado Springs, he was a likable, capable young soldier, someone who had served his country and was simply enjoying life, friends, and the holiday season that year. December 24, 1968. Jack's last Christmas Eve began like many for a young soldier stationed away from home. According to later reconstructions of the case, he spent the evening celebrating Christmas Eve with a fellow soldier in downtown Colorado Springs. Some sources indicate that after a night of festivities, Jack and his friend drove from Fort Carson into the city and parked for the night in a parked car. At some point, Jack lay down on the seat to rest, while the friend apparently left the vicinity after the night's celebrations. It was late and not far from the next calendar day, but the young soldier was simply relaxing after a night of fellowship. At or just after midnight, Colorado Springs Police Department, CSPD, received a call about a man lying inside a vehicle on the 100 block of East Cuchata Street,
A patrol officer responded around 12:15 a.m. and found Jack inside the parked car, apparently resting. When checked on by the officer, he reportedly said he was fine, just resting after celebrating Christmas Eve with friends. That brief check was the last moment when Jack's life appeared normal. What happened next would turn that night into tragedy. Around 12:39 a.m., two CSPD officers driving on patrol spotted something deeply disturbing near the parked car. There, on the sidewalk at the intersection of Cuchadas and Nevada Avenue, lay Jack unconscious and seriously wounded from a gunshot to the chest. The exact moment and circumstances of the shooting are unclear, whether it occurred inside the car or just outside, as sources do not specify whether Jack was shot while still inside the vehicle before collapsing behind it, or if he was shot after leaving the car. What is clear is this: he was mortally wounded. Police and emergency responders rushed Jack to St. Francis Hospital in Colorado Springs. Despite the urgency of care, he was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The fatal wound was a small caliber gunshot to the heart, often described in sources as a shot from a .22 or .25 caliber weapon. At 23 years old, Jack's life ended on Christmas morning in a way that shocked his family and friends in Colorado Springs and back home in Ohio. In the immediate aftermath, local law enforcement treated the case as a homicide. Officers questioned the friend with whom Jack celebrated Christmas Eve, other friends known to be in the area that night, potential eyewitnesses who may have seen Jack earlier or later in the evening. The FBI also became involved in the investigation, reflecting either the era's protocols for unusual crimes involving military personnel or broader jurisdictional cooperation. Despite questioning and investigative effort, detectives did not identify a clear suspect, motive, or compelling leads by the end of the week, even by December 29, 1968. Reporting suggests that robbery was not believed to be the motive because Jack was not robbed and no personal property was reported missing at the scene. The murder of Jack Krogacker quickly became a cold case, one that remained unresolved despite early investigation. Cold cases like this remind communities that not all crimes receive closure, especially in an era before modern forensic technology, widespread surveillance cameras, or digital evidence trails. To grasp the difficulty of investigation at the time, it helps to understand that in 1968, DNA evidence did not exist. Police largely relied on eyewitnesses and rudimentary ballistics. Surveillance cameras were rare. Communication between agencies was slower. Jack's death occurred in a period where many crimes that might be solvable today remained mysteries. The culture of the 1960s, especially around holidays and public celebrations, meant people were less inclined to stay on the scene, give statements, or recall details later. Even today, the most enduring questions about this case are: was Jack shot while inside the car or after leaving it? Was the shooter someone hostile or reckless? Did someone Jack know do this, or was it a tragedy involving strangers? Did anyone see or hear anything important that night but never came forward? Nothing in official records points to a witness who saw the actual shooting or any surveillance footage that might have captured the event. Jack was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Brook Park, Ohio, far from the scene of his death, but close to the community where he grew up. For his family and those who knew him, his passing, especially on Christmas, would be a lifelong memory of loss that never found answers. More than 50 years later, the unsolved murder of Jack Krogacker remains listed among Colorado's most persistent cold cases. These cases also illustrate the limits of law enforcement capabilities at the time and the enduring hope that someone somewhere might one day come forward with the key piece of information that finally lets justice close the book on Jack's death.
If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Feel free to share your thoughts or theories in the comments below. I read every one. If you found this story interesting, consider subscribing and sharing it with others. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.